May 8, 1945. In a red brick schoolhouse in the French city of Reims, the instruments of surrender were signed. The war in Europe was over. Germany's capitulation was complete, its cities reduced to rubble, its army scattered and defeated. Across a shattered continent littered with the wreckage of total war, millions of soldiers laid down their weapons. They emerged from bunkers and trenches, from hiding places in forests and cellars, their hands raised in surrender, their faces gaunt with exhaustion and the knowledge of defeat. Among them were men who had worn a uniform that inspired particular dread across Europe. The double lightning bolts, the death's head insignia, the black collar patches of the Waffen SS. For 6 years, these symbols had represented the cutting edge of Nazi military power and ideological fanaticism. Hitler's so-called elite force had fought on every front, from the frozen steppes of Russia, where they battled in temperatures that could freeze a man solid, to the beaches of Normandy, where they faced the Allied invasion. From the brutal partisan wars in the Balkans to specialized operations in North Africa and Italy. They had built a reputation for military effectiveness, but also for ruthlessness that exceeded even the brutal standards of the Second World War. Now, with the Third Reich in ruins and their Führer dead by his own hand in a Berlin bunker, these men faced an uncertain and often terrifying future. The black uniform that had once commanded fear and respect across occupied Europe had become a liability, a mark of identification that could mean summary execution, decades in a Soviet labor camp, or at best, years of imprisonment and social stigma in a Germany struggling to be reborn. Some would stand trial at Nuremberg and in courts across liberated Europe. Others would vanish into the chaos of post-war displacement, finding new identities and new lives far from the continent they had helped devastate. Many would quietly attempt to rebuild their lives in the ruins of Germany itself, their pasts carefully hidden behind bureaucratic paperwork or deliberately rewritten in convenient fictions of ignorance and innocence. The story of what happened to the Waffen SS after 1945 is not a simple tale of justice served or evaded. It's a complex narrative that reveals uncomfortable truths about post-war politics, Cold War pragmatism, and the malleability of historical memory itself, the final days and immediate aftermath. As the Allied armies converged on Germany from east and west in the spring of 1945, Waffen SS units found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Unlike the regular Wehrmacht, these men knew that their organization carried a particularly dark reputation. The Allied powers had already made it clear that the SS would be treated differently from other German military formations. For the hundreds of thousands of Waffen SS soldiers scattered across the dying Reich, the question was not if they would surrender, but to whom. The distinction mattered enormously. Western Allied forces, particularly the Americans and British, generally adhered to the Geneva Convention in their treatment of prisoners, despite the SS not technically qualifying for such protections. But even within Western custody, Waffen SS members were segregated from regular Wehrmacht prisoners. They were herded into special compounds, often under open sky with minimal shelter. Food was scarce. Disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded camps. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was brutally cold, and thousands died from exposure, dysentery, and starvation before they ever faced a courtroom. The situation for those who surrendered to Soviet forces was far grimmer. The Red Army had endured unspeakable horrors at the hands of German forces on the Eastern Front. Waffen SS units had been particularly ruthless in their anti-partisan operations and their treatment of Soviet prisoners. The Soviets remembered. Many Waffen SS men who fell into Soviet hands were executed on the spot, particularly officers and those identified as having served in certain notorious divisions. Others were marched eastward into captivity in the Soviet Union, beginning journeys from which many would never return. According to German government estimates compiled years later, approximately 3 million German military personnel were taken prisoner by the Soviet Union. Of these, more than 1 million died in captivity. While not all were Waffen SS, A disproportionate number of SS men perished in Soviet camps. Those who survived faced years, sometimes decades, of forced labor in mines, construction projects, and factories across the vast Soviet Empire. The last of these prisoners would not return to Germany until 1956, more than a decade after the war's end. The legal reckoning for the Waffen SS came swiftly. The Nuremberg Trials, which opened in November 1945, became the defining moment of post-war justice. 21 of the most prominent surviving Nazi leaders stood in the dock, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. But the tribunal went further. It also examined entire organizations within the Nazi state, seeking to determine their collective criminality. On September 30th, 1946, the International Military Tribunal issued its verdict on the SS. The judgment was unambiguous. The SS, including the Waffen SS, was declared a criminal organization. This meant that membership itself could constitute grounds for prosecution. However, the tribunal made important distinctions. Those who had been conscripted after 1943, particularly from occupied territories, might claim they had no choice. Those who could prove they had no knowledge of or participation in criminal activities might also avoid punishment. But for the hundreds of thousands of voluntary members, especially those who had joined before 1943, the verdict created a legal shadow that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Denazification courts sprang up across occupied Germany, tasked with the monumental challenge of sorting millions of former Nazis and their collaborators into categories. The system classified individuals ranging from major offenders who faced trial and imprisonment to fellow travelers who might receive fines or temporary employment restrictions, to those deemed to have been followers who received minimal punishment. For Waffen SS members, the outcomes varied wildly depending on rank, unit, theater of service, and increasingly the political climate of the zone in which they were tried. A handful of high-ranking Waffen SS officers faced war crimes tribunals. Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was tried and convicted for the murder of Canadian prisoners of war in Normandy. Joachim Peiper faced trial for the Malmedy massacre, where his battle group had executed American prisoners during the Battle of the Bulge. Yet these were exceptions. The vast machinery of Allied justice, overwhelmed by the sheer number of cases and increasingly influenced by Cold War considerations, gradually lost momentum. By 1948, most lower-ranking Waffen SS men had been released from detention camps, their records marked, but their immediate punishment complete. Escape, flight, and the ratlines. Not everyone chose to face Allied justice. As Germany collapsed, a minority of Waffen SS officers and men made the calculated decision to flee Europe entirely. What emerged in the chaotic aftermath of the war was a shadowy network of escape routes that historians would later call the ratlines. The term, borrowed from maritime terminology describing the small rope ladders sailors climbed to escape sinking ships, proved grimly appropriate. The ratlines did not emerge fully formed. Rather, they developed organically as desperate men sought any route to safety. Two primary corridors took shape. The first ran through Spain, still governed by the fascist dictator Francisco Franco, who remained sympathetic to former Axis personnel. The second and ultimately more significant route led through the Alps into Italy, through Rome, and then by ship from Italian ports to South America. These routes developed independently at first, but their operators eventually began to coordinate their efforts. The networks relied on a troubling coalition of enablers who operated in the shadows of post-war Europe. Certain Catholic clergy played crucial roles, viewing their assistance as a humanitarian mission to help refugees, though they often knew exactly who they were helping. Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal, based in Rome, became perhaps the most notorious of these ecclesiastical helpers. A man of deeply conservative political views and virulent anti-communism, Hudal had written sympathetically about National Socialism in the 1930s. In his memoirs, published years later, Hudal would write without apparent shame that he felt duty-bound to help former National Socialists and fascists, including so-called war criminals. He viewed the Allied war against Germany not as a moral crusade against genocide, but as economic rivalry between capitalist powers dressed up in democratic rhetoric. This worldview allowed him to facilitate the escape of numerous SS officers with what he considered a clean conscience, believing he was saving them from victor's justice rather than helping mass murderers escape accountability. Hudal's operation was methodical and effective. His position in Rome gave him access to the International Red Cross offices and diplomatic channels. He could arrange for false identity papers, transforming an SS officer into a displaced person fleeing Soviet persecution. He provided temporary shelter, often in monasteries or church properties. Most importantly, he could arrange for the crucial travel documents that would allow passage to South America. For the fugitives who found their way to his door, Hudal was literally a lifesaver. The difference between capture and freedom, between a hangman's noose and a new life under a new name. Alongside Hudal, Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović operated an even more sophisticated network centered at the San Girolamo Seminary in Rome. Draganović had connections stretching from Austria through Italy to embarkation points in Genoa. He maintained links with Croatian fascist networks and proved remarkably efficient at moving fugitives through the system. His motivations appeared to mix anti-communism with Croatian nationalism, viewing these German and Croatian fascists as potential allies in a future struggle against Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. The International Committee of the Red Cross, despite its humanitarian mission, inadvertently became another crucial link in the chain. The Rome office issued travel documents to refugees that were accepted as de facto passports in South America. While these were supposed to be signed for in person after proper vetting, blank forms somehow found their way to Hudal and others. In numerous documented cases, the signature of the Red Cross official was later proven to have been forged. With these precious documents in hand, a war criminal could transform himself into a displaced person fleeing persecution. South America, particularly Argentina, became the primary destination for these fugitives. Argentine President Juan Perón had developed an admiration for European fascism during his time as a military attaché in Italy. He viewed the Nuremberg Trials as an insult to military honor and saw practical value in attracting German scientists, engineers, and military expertise to Argentina. In 1946, Perón enlisted Cardinal Antonio Caggiano to open dialogue with European counterparts, effectively creating a official Argentine ratline. As many as 5,000 Nazi war criminals may have reached Argentina by 1950, when Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust, stepped off a ship in Buenos Aires under the alias Ricardo Clement. Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Bolivia also became havens for fleeing SS officers, though in smaller numbers. Each country had its own motivations. Some had significant German immigrant populations that provided natural cover. Others were swayed by bribes or the promise of technical expertise. Many South American leaders, themselves often military strongmen, shared ideological sympathies with the fugitives, or at least viewed anti-communism as a more important consideration than war crimes committed on another continent. Not all escapees were senior officials. Karl Nicolucci Leck, a former Waffen SS Panzer commander from South Tyrol, had made his way to Argentina in 1948. He built a quiet life there, never facing justice for his wartime service. Leon de Grelle, the Belgian SS volunteer who had commanded the Walloon Legion on the Eastern Front, attempted to flee to South America but crashed his plane in Spain. He recovered and spent the rest of his life in Spain, dying there in 1994, having evaded extradition attempts for decades. Otto Skorzeny, the famous SS commando who had rescued Mussolini and led infiltration operations during the Battle of the Bulge, also found refuge in Spain before eventually settling in Ireland. The ratlines remained operational through the early 1950s, though they became increasingly risky as Nazi hunting organizations began to understand and track these networks. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter and Holocaust survivor, worked tirelessly to expose these escape routes and the men who used them. His efforts, and those of others, eventually led to the capture of several high-profile fugitives. Adolf Eichmann was famously kidnapped by Israeli agents in Buenos Aires in 1960 and subsequently tried and executed in Israel. But for every Eichmann brought to justice, many more former Waffen SS officers lived out their lives in comfort. their crimes unpunished and often unknown to their new neighbors. Reintegration in West Germany. For those who remained in Germany, the late 1940s brought a different kind of reckoning. The newly formed Federal Republic of Germany, established in May 1949, faced an enormous challenge. How could it build a democratic society while reintegrating millions of former Nazi Party members and soldiers? Among these were an estimated 250,000 former Waffen SS veterans living in what became West Germany. These men were younger than many Wehrmacht veterans, often in their 20s and 30s. They had battle experience and military discipline, but they also carried the stigma of having served in an organization that the Nuremberg Tribunal had condemned as criminal. The Western Allies' initial stance was clear and uncompromising. Waffen SS veterans were to be excluded from civil service pensions and public employment. Unlike regular Wehrmacht soldiers, who were increasingly portrayed as having served their country honorably, if perhaps misguidedly, the SS remained beyond the pale. But this moral clarity soon collided with the practical realities of the Cold War. West Germany needed stability. It needed rapid reconstruction. And increasingly it needed to rearm as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Conservative politicians, led by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, recognized that excluding hundreds of thousands of veterans from economic and political life risked creating a disaffected, potentially radical constituency. The specter of Weimar-era instability haunted German politics. Adenauer and his colleagues calculated that integration was safer than alienation, even if it meant moral compromise. The votes of veterans and their families could determine election outcomes. Politicians began to court these constituencies, including former Waffen SS men. The vehicle for this political rehabilitation was HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen SS, or Mutual Aid Association of Former Waffen SS Members. Founded in October 1951, HIAG began as a welfare organization to support comrades who had been denied state pensions and benefits. Its leaders were not ordinary soldiers, but former generals and senior officers. Paul Hauser, Otto Kumm, and Felix Steiner had all commanded major Waffen SS formations during the war. They were articulate, well-connected, and determined to reshape the narrative around their wartime service. HIAG's core argument was deceptively simple, but politically powerful. The Waffen SS, they claimed, had been an apolitical fighting force, soldiers like any other. Yes, they wore SS insignia, but they had fought under military command on conventional battlefields. They had not run concentration camps or participated in genocide. Those crimes, HIAG insisted, were the work of other SS branches, the Allgemeine SS, the Totenkopfverbände, concentration camp guards, and the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units. The Waffen SS had been warriors, not war criminals. This narrative was largely false, as historical research would later conclusively demonstrate, but in the 1950s it found a receptive audience. HIAG quickly established branches across West Germany and began publishing magazines, particularly Der Freiwillige, or The Volunteer. These publications presented sanitized accounts of Waffen SS operations, emphasized unit camaraderie, and systematically minimized or denied war crimes. In 1953, Paul Hauser published a book titled Soldaten wie andere auch, or Soldiers Like Any Other. The phrase became HIAG's unofficial slogan, and remarkably, it was soon adopted by mainstream politicians. In December 1953, Chancellor Adenauer, himself speaking to members of his Christian Democratic Union Party, made a statement that would echo for decades. He declared that the men of the Waffen SS had been soldiers like everyone else. This was not a slip of the tongue or an offhand remark. It was a calculated political statement, signaling West Germany's quiet shift toward normalizing Waffen SS veterans within the broader community of German soldiers. The political implications were enormous. If the Waffen SS were just soldiers, then they deserved the same treatment as Wehrmacht veterans, including pensions and the right to serve in the new German armed forces. The practical results came quickly. The Federal War Victims Relief Act of 1950, designed to support disabled veterans and war widows, became a subject of fierce debate. Should Waffen SS veterans receive benefits? Conservative politicians calculating the electoral mathematics decided they should. By the mid-1950s, many former SS men could claim limited pensions, especially if they could demonstrate conscription after 1943 rather than voluntary enlistment. The distinction often came down to paperwork and testimony, both of which could be massaged or fabricated. When West Germany established the Bundeswehr in 1955, the question arose whether former Waffen SS men could serve. In theory, the answer was yes, up to the rank of a lieutenant colonel. In practice, the numbers were carefully limited. By September 1956, out of 3,117 applications from former Waffen SS men, only 508 were approved. The rest were rejected due to ideological concerns, criminal records, or pressure from Allied advisors who feared the new German army would inherit a tainted legacy. Yet those who did make it back into uniform often kept quiet about their pasts, blending into the ranks of the new democratic military. HIAG's influence peaked in the 1960s. Some former SS officers secured public positions. Commemorative events for Waffen SS divisions were held openly and covered by local media without significant criticism. The organization claimed to represent millions of potential voters, though historians later determined this was a massive exaggeration. HIAG's actual membership probably never exceeded 20,000, about 8% of living Waffen SS veterans. But the organization punched above its weight through political connections and media savvy. Behind the scenes, HIAG cultivated relationships with both major parties. The Christian Democrats and their Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, were natural allies given their conservative base. But even the Social Democratic Party maintained contacts with HIAG. Party leader Kurt Schumacher, himself a Nazi persecution survivor, met with HIAG leaders in 1951. He believed the organization represented a politically significant constituency that needed to be integrated into democratic politics rather than alienated. Future Chancellor Helmut Schmidt addressed a gathering of Waffen SS veterans in Hamburg in 1953, acknowledging their combat service and urging their reintegration. This political courting came at a moral cost that became increasingly apparent as Germany's younger generation began confronting the Nazi past more directly in the 1960s and 70s. Student movements challenged the silence and complicity of their parents' generation. Historians and journalists began exposing HIAG's revisionist tendencies and its systematic efforts to minimize or deny war crimes. In 1978, the news magazine Der Spiegel published a devastating investigation revealing HIAG's deep political ties and its pressure campaigns on pension reforms. The scandal marked a turning point. Mainstream parties began to distance themselves. HIAG's credibility weakened, though the organization remained active for another decade, sustained by aging veterans determined to defend their version of history. By the 1980s, HIAG's membership was declining as veterans aged and died. The organization fought increasingly marginal battles over memorials and cemetery plaques, while anti-fascist groups protested Waffen SS reunions. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and German reunification the following year created a new political landscape. In 1992, facing dwindling membership and mounting public disapproval, HIAG officially dissolved. But the narratives it had spent 4 decades constructing did not disappear with it. The Long Shadow, Modern Legacy and Moral Reckoning. When HIAG disbanded, many believed the debate over the Waffen SS would finally fade into history. Instead, the legacy proved remarkably persistent, continuing to shape discussions of war memory, justice, and national identity well into the 21st century. The reunified Germany that emerged after 1989 started confronting its wartime past more openly, aided by newly accessible archives from the former East Germany and the Soviet Union. What these documents revealed was damning. Historical research in the 1990s and 2000s systematically dismantled the myth of the apolitical Waffen SS scholars. Like Sonke Neitzel and Peter Lungerich analyzed how ideology, discipline, and violence fused within the Waffen SS structure. The organization was never separate from Nazi politics. It was the armed extension of SS ideology, intimately connected to the apparatus of genocide. Waffen SS units had not merely fought conventional battles. They had operated alongside Einsatzgruppen in mass shootings. They had participated in anti-partisan operations that were often covers for massacring civilians. They had guarded ghettos and assisted in deportations. The clean Wehrmacht myth was bad enough, but the clean Waffen SS myth was even more transparently false. Yet, even as scholarship demolished these illusions, new controversies emerged. In the 1990s, journalists discovered that some former Waffen SS members were still receiving state pensions under the old Federal War Victims Relief Act. Reports in Der Spiegel and the New York Times sparked international outrage, especially when it became clear that many Holocaust survivors had never received comparable compensation. Successive German governments debated reforms, but pension laws, rooted in post-war legal compromises and constitutional protections, proved difficult to undo completely. Beyond Germany's borders, the Waffen SS legacy took disturbing new forms. In parts of Eastern Europe, especially the Baltic states and Ukraine, veterans of locally recruited SS divisions began to be commemorated as national fighters against Soviet occupation. Annual marches in Riga honored the 15th and 19th Latvian SS divisions. Similar commemorations occurred in Estonia and Ukraine. These events drew sharp criticism from Jewish organizations and the European Parliament, which viewed them as rehabilitating Nazi collaborators. But for some in these countries, the historical narrative was more complex. They saw these men not as Nazis, but as nationalists who had fought against Soviet tyranny, even if they had done so in SS uniforms. This tension revealed how the Waffen SS legacy had become entangled with post-Soviet identity politics. The Nuremberg Tribunal had made exceptions for conscripts from occupied territories, recognizing that many had little choice in their service. But this legal nuance did little to resolve the moral questions. Could one simultaneously honor resistance to Soviet occupation and acknowledge participation in Nazi crimes? The debate continues today, with different communities arriving at vastly different answers. Inside Germany, attitudes shifted decisively by the 2000s. Open admiration for the Waffen SS became taboo. Displaying SS symbols was banned under Section 86A of the Criminal Code. Yet far-right groups online continued to use SS imagery, portraying the Waffen SS as models of strength or European brotherhood. German authorities cracked down repeatedly, viewing such activity as a threat to democracy. The specter of neo-Nazi movements appropriating Waffen SS symbolism remains a concern for law enforcement and educators. In academic circles, the conversation moved from moral judgment to historical context. Researchers analyzed recruitment patterns, training regimens, and the mechanisms by which young men were indoctrinated into SS ideology. They studied how ordinary soldiers became participants in extraordinary crimes. Social historians explored how post-war Germany's silence toward the Waffen SS reflected the nation's broader struggle with guilt and memory. The question was no longer whether the Waffen SS was criminal, that was settled, but rather how and why democratic West Germany had allowed its partial rehabilitation. The last surviving Waffen SS veterans are now in their 90s or have passed away. Their associations have vanished. Der Freiwillige magazine, once HIAG's flagship publication, ceased operations. Yet the legacy endures in books, memoirs, and myths. Online forums still debate the organization's role and record. Some present cherry-picked evidence to portray certain units as honorable. Others engage in outright historical denial. The battle over how the Waffen SS is remembered continues in classrooms, museums, and public discourse. Perhaps most significantly, the story of the Waffen SS after 1945 serves as a cautionary tale about how easily history can be reshaped when convenient. The narrative that HIAG constructed, that these were merely soldiers caught in the wrong uniform, was factually false but politically useful. It allowed German society to reintegrate hundreds of thousands of veterans without fully confronting what they had done. It enabled the Cold War alliance system to prioritize anti-communism over war crimes justice. It demonstrated that even crimes as well documented as those of the Waffen SS could be minimized, rationalized, and partially excused if enough powerful people found it expedient to do so. 80 years after the guns fell silent in Europe, the question of where the Waffen SS went after 1945 has many answers, each revealing something about the choices societies make in confronting their darkest chapters. Some went to South American exile, stepping off ships in Buenos Aires or Rio de Janeiro with forged papers and false names, building new lives while their victims' families still searched for answers about what had happened to their loved ones. Some went to Soviet labor camps in the frozen wastes of Siberia or Kazakhstan, dying far from home in conditions almost as brutal as those they had inflicted on others. Some went back to German farms and factories, blending back into civilian life, keeping silent about their service while their neighbors pretended not to know or simply chose not to ask. Some went into political organizations like HIAG that fought tenaciously to rewrite their history, to transform perpetrators into victims, to claim that those who had served an ideology of racial extermination were merely soldiers following orders. Some went to their graves believing they had done nothing wrong, convinced by decades of their own propaganda that they had been honorable warriors betrayed by history, and their legacy went into the contested terrain of historical memory, where it remains a subject of scholarship, controversy, and painful moral reckoning. The final accounting is this, and it must be stated clearly and without equivocation. The men of the Waffen SS were not simply soldiers who happened to wear different insignia or who found themselves in the wrong branch of service by accident of recruitment. They were members of an organization that placed racial ideology at its core, that viewed certain peoples as subhuman and therefore expendable, that saw brutality as a virtue and mercy as weakness, and that participated willingly in the machinery of genocide. Whether they pulled triggers in mass executions, guarded ghettos awaiting deportation, or fought in combat operations that routinely blurred the lines between warfare and war crimes, they were part of a system designed to implement the darkest vision of the 20th century. The efforts to portray them otherwise, to integrate them seamlessly into post-war society without meaningful accountability, to grant them pensions and sometimes even honor while their victims often received neither recognition nor compensation. These efforts succeeded in the short term, but have been judged harshly by history and will continue to be. The story of what happened to the Waffen SS after 1945 is ultimately a story about how societies choose to remember or forget, to confront painful truths or deny them, to seek justice even when inconvenient or embrace expedience when politically useful. Today, as the last witnesses pass from living memory into history, the responsibility falls to educators, historians, and citizens to ensure that the full truth is not lost in convenient mythology. The men in black uniforms who surrendered in May 1945 went many directions, but the truth about who they were and what they did should go only one direction: forward, preserved, and unvarnished, as a warning about what happens when ideology and violence merge, and what happens when societies choose comfort over confrontation with uncomfortable truths. If you found this exploration of post-war history insightful, please like this video and subscribe to WW2 Tales for more in-depth examinations of the Second World War and its aftermath. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next journey into history. Thanks for watching, and remember, understanding the past helps us build a better future.